The town of Riverside, cozy and picturesque, had always prided itself on its close-knit community. At its heart stood the Light of Hope Church, led by Jonathan Grace. A tall, charismatic man with a warm smile and a resonant voice, he seemed to embody the ideal pastor. Jonathan was the one who always found the right words, supported people in difficult times, and inspired them with his example. His family was equally admired. His wife, Emily, calm and graceful, epitomized unwavering support and devotion. Together they raised three wonderful children: Sophia, the inquisitive and intelligent eldest daughter; Jack, the middle child who dreamed of becoming an athlete; and little Lily, who adored painting. The Graces seemed like the perfect family, a role model for everyone in town. Jonathan, along with his close friend and assistant David Carter, managed the church with extraordinary harmony. David, a younger and energetic pastor of youth ministries, became a true mentor to the town's youth. He organized camps, workshops, and volunteer activities that brought the community together, fostering a sense of unity and joy. Together, Jonathan and David were an unstoppable duo, seemingly unshakable in their mission. The church thrived. Every Sunday service drew crowds, and the charitable events organized by the community provided aid to those most in need. For Jonathan, this was more than just a duty. It was his calling. He devoted most of his time to the church, deeply believing that God had chosen him for this sacred mission. But behind this picture-perfect facade, invisible cracks began to form. They were so small at first that they seemed imperceptible, but they were already there. One day, Emily and Sophia went to a routine medical checkup with their local doctor. It was a standard procedure, but the doctor, reviewing the blood test results, noticed something unusual. Sophia's blood type could not have been inherited from Jonathan. The doctor gently suggested that a DNA test might be in order. Although it seemed like a mere formality, Emily couldn't hide her unease. She agreed, but already she felt a cold wave of dread wash over her. While Jonathan conducted church meetings and inspired the community toward charitable deeds, Emily kept the secret to herself. Every time she looked at Sophia, she was gripped by a sense of guilt. She realized that she might lose everything that she and Jonathan had worked so hard to build. And yet, memories she had buried deep within herself began to resurface. David, who was a frequent guest in their home, noticed that something was troubling Emily. He started spending more time with her, trying to help. Jonathan, though not immediately, began to sense this shift. He felt that Emily was somehow distancing herself from him, but he dismissed these thoughts, attributing them to the weariness of daily life. His perfect family could not be the source of any problems. It was the foundation of his entire life. Yet the secret that had taken root deep within Emily was like a ticking time bomb. Though it seemed the moment hadn't yet arrived, each passing minute brought them closer to the point when everything would change forever. The DNA test results Emily received a few days later left her devastated. It confirmed what she had feared most. Jonathan was not Sophia's biological father. Sitting in her car outside the clinic, Emily reread the document over and over, as if the words might change with each pass. But they remained unaltered, like a verdict set in stone. Her heart raced, and every fiber of her being felt the icy grip of fear. She knew that this truth had the potential to destroy not only her family, but everything Jonathan had built: his reputation, his community, his church. Emily decided to hide the results. She carefully folded the documents, tucked them into her bag, and forced herself to calm down. "This must never come to light," she repeated to herself like a mantra. But the fear and guilt gnawed at her, making it impossible for her to remain the same person she had been before. That evening at dinner, she seemed distant, barely engaging in conversation and avoiding Jonathan's gaze. Her behavior began to change, despite her efforts to conceal it. Jonathan, always attuned to the smallest changes in people, quickly noticed her withdrawal. At first, he chose not to press her. He thought it might be exhaustion or some trivial concern she didn't want to discuss. But as the days turned into weeks and her behavior showed no improvement, Jonathan grew increasingly worried. He watched Emily more closely, noticing her tension and, most troubling of all, the way she glanced at David during his visits, fleeting but charged looks that he couldn't ignore. David continued to visit their home regularly, as he always had. He brought gifts for the children, assisted Jonathan with church activities, and stayed for dinner, his demeanor unchanged. But Jonathan began to notice things he hadn't before. The conversations between David and Emily seemed too easy, sometimes even overly familiar. He saw how Emily seemed to transform in David's presence. Her eyes sparkled and her voice softened. And while Jonathan tried to push these thoughts aside, doubts began to take root, growing like seeds in the fertile soil of his anxieties. It was a mere accident that changed everything. A few days later, Jonathan came home earlier than usual and decided to check the mailbox before entering the house. Among the letters, he found an envelope containing the DNA test results. It was addressed to Emily. At first, Jonathan intended to hand it to her, but something stopped him. Taking the envelope to his study, he locked the door, carefully opened it, and began to read. Each word hit him like a hammer. Jonathan sat in silence, holding the paper in his trembling hands. Shock and pain coursed through him. But the worst was yet to come. He reread the sentence that unequivocally stated, "The tested individual is not the biological father of the child." There was no room for doubt. Jonathan's mind turned to David. Suddenly, everything that had seemed inconsequential before, the glances, the smiles, the familiar exchanges, took on a new, damning significance. Determined to confirm his suspicions, Jonathan decided to confront the matter head-on. The next day, he visited the clinic to speak with the doctor. The doctor explained that the test was a standard procedure and the results were accurate. She subtly suggested that Jonathan discuss the matter with Emily, but he merely thanked her and left. His face betrayed no confusion now. His suspicions had solidified into certainty, burning fiercely within him. Jonathan was no longer the kind-hearted pastor who trusted his family. He was now a man seeking answers. His anger grew steadily. He tried to mask his emotions, but at night, lying in bed beside Emily, he could no longer sleep peacefully. He stared at her profile in the darkness, silently asking himself, how could she do this to me? Jonathan wandered through the house like a shadow, consumed by tangled thoughts and an unrelenting suspicion that was poisoning his life. He could no longer look at Emily the way he once did. Every time she entered the room, his heart clenched with pain and anger. But he remained silent, determined to be certain about what his wife was hiding from him. One morning while Emily went to the store, Jonathan decided to act. He took a few toothbrushes belonging to his children from the bathroom cabinet and discreetly brought them to a laboratory. He knew that Sophia's DNA test didn't give him the full picture. To uncover the entire truth, he needed to test Jack and Lily as well. His hands trembled as he handed over the samples to the lab technician, but his voice remained steady. "This is for a research study," he lied. The days that followed felt like an eternity. Jonathan behaved with restraint, even as a storm of emotions brewed inside him. Emily noticed his growing coldness, but was too afraid to ask him about it. The weight of her own secret loomed over her, and she feared that any conversation might expose her. She tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but Jonathan could see her nervousness. Her tension only fueled his suspicions. When the results finally arrived, Jonathan felt as though he couldn't breathe. He opened the envelope, his hands trembling, like a man who knew the words inside would forever alter his life. The first test, Jack. The result was the same. Jonathan was not the biological father. He froze but forced himself to move on to the next result. Lily, again, the same. The conclusion was definitive. His suspicions had been confirmed entirely. Jonathan sat in his study, gripping the results, feeling something dark and destructive unfurling within him. It was a storm of pain, rage, and despair. His world had crumbled. There was no longer any denying the obvious. Every child he had loved and raised was the result of betrayal. His family was nothing more than an illusion. That evening, Jonathan's demeanor was so cold that even the children sensed something was wrong. Sophia tried to lighten the mood with a joke, but Jonathan merely nodded, his gaze fixed on his plate. Emily noticed his icy behavior and looked at him cautiously, but she said nothing. She felt as though any word she uttered might trigger the explosion she had feared for so long. Jonathan could no longer stand idly by. He began to observe David in secret. David still visited their home often, bringing gifts for the children, helping Jonathan with church matters, and chatting with Emily. Outwardly, everything seemed as it always had, but Jonathan now saw what he hadn't before. He noticed how David looked at Emily, the way their conversations seemed too easy, their glances too lingering and meaningful. One evening, Jonathan even followed David after a church service. He watched as David stopped at a cafe, spoke briefly on the phone, and then calmly walked to his car. Everything seemed ordinary on the surface, but Jonathan felt that behind this facade of normalcy lay something sinister. Meanwhile, Emily was making increasingly desperate attempts to restore harmony in the family. She suggested family evenings together, planned a trip out of town, but Jonathan always found excuses to avoid them. He no longer wanted to be near her. Her very presence filled him with disgust, though he kept these feelings to himself. The tension in the house continued to build. Jonathan felt that every moment of silence between him and Emily brought them closer to the inevitable explosion. He knew he couldn't keep silent much longer, but before he acted, he wanted to uncover the full truth. His mind became consumed by a single thought. David must pay for this. This thought became his obsession. Jonathan was no longer the pastor the community admired. He had become a man who had lost everything he cherished, and now he sought only the truth, even if that truth would destroy everything for good. The day began like any other. The sun over Riverside seemed ordinary, but within Jonathan's soul a dark storm was brewing, ready to erupt at any moment. Emily was preparing breakfast, the children were getting ready for school, and Jonathan sat at the table, staring into his cup of coffee, which had long gone cold. His thoughts were far away, circling around the DNA results, David, and the years he had believed were happy but now felt like a cruel lie. His hand trembled slightly, and he struggled to contain the words that he knew would destroy everything. That evening, Jonathan returned home earlier than usual. The door was locked, but the light in the living room was on. As he stepped inside, he heard voices. Emily and David stood in the corner of the room, speaking in hushed tones. Their faces were tense and their conversation stopped abruptly as soon as Jonathan walked in. David quickly apologized and said he needed to leave. He made his way to the door, but Jonathan stopped him with a piercing glare, full of barely restrained fury. David seemed not to notice and left. Emily remained standing by the window, avoiding her husband's gaze. A tense silence hung in the air for only a few moments before Jonathan's cold voice shattered it. "What are you hiding from me?" he asked, his tone icy and measured. Emily flinched but tried to keep her composure. "Nothing, Jonathan, you're just tired." "Tired?" He laughed bitterly and raised his hand, holding the documents. "The DNA test results. Is this what you call being tired? Explain to me, Emily, how it's possible that none of our children are mine." Emily turned pale. She knew the moment she had dreaded for so many years had finally arrived. "I can explain," she began, but Jonathan cut her off. "Then explain," he shouted, his voice rising. "Who? Was it David? Is it him?" Her silence spoke louder than any confession. Jonathan felt his body flood with a burning rage. "Is it true?" he demanded. "Say it out loud." Emily tried to remain calm, but her voice betrayed her. "Yes, it's true," she finally whispered, barely audibly. "David is their father." Those words were the final blow. They detonated in Jonathan's mind like a thunderclap, shattering the last barriers of his self-control. His hands clenched into fists, and a red haze clouded his vision. "How could you?" he hissed through gritted teeth. Emily took a step back, but Jonathan was no longer himself. In a blind, impulsive rage, he grabbed a heavy candlestick from the table. It happened in an instant. Emily fell to the floor, motionless. Jonathan froze, staring at what he had done. Time seemed to stand still. He was overwhelmed by shock, confusion, and an eerie emptiness. The weight of his actions didn't fully register at first. Slowly, he lowered the candlestick to the floor and took a few steps back. His mind was in chaos, but he knew there was no going back now. His life had officially fallen apart. He began to act on autopilot, removing his blood-stained clothes, placing them in a barrel, and burning them in the fireplace. He wiped the floor, erasing the evidence, and then left the house, leaving the children behind. That night, Jonathan went to the source of his anger. His thoughts fixated on David, the man he believed was the root of all the betrayal, pain, and destruction in his life. He resolved that David had to pay. The morning after, the Grace household was eerily silent, yet the atmosphere was heavy with unease. The children woke up and immediately noticed their mother's absence. Emily was always there to greet them with a smile, but this time she was nowhere to be found. Sophia, the eldest, began searching the house, but all she found was a mess in the living room, a broken lamp and a spilled drink staining the carpet. Her worry deepened. When Emily didn't answer her calls, Sophia dialed the police. Sheriff Michael Brooks, a seasoned lawman with years of experience in Riverside, was the first to arrive at the scene. He instantly sensed that something was amiss. At first glance, there were no overt signs of violence in the house, but his trained eye caught subtle details that raised his suspicions. Brooks noticed inconsistencies in the state of the house that prompted him to launch a full investigation. His primary concern, however, was the whereabouts of Jonathan Grace, who was also missing. Jonathan's absence only deepened the mystery. Brooks began interviewing neighbors and members of the church. Several people mentioned that Jonathan had seemed troubled recently. The doctor who had conducted Sophia's DNA test also came forward, sharing that Jonathan had visited the clinic to confirm the results. This led the sheriff to suspect that the family's turmoil ran deeper than anyone had imagined. David Carter, too, came under scrutiny. As Jonathan's close friend and frequent visitor to the Grace household, David naturally drew the police's attention. Several parishioners hinted that David had a close relationship with Emily, which fueled suspicions that his role in the unfolding tragedy might be greater than it appeared. However, during his police interrogation, David adamantly denied any involvement, claiming he had no knowledge of what might have happened. Meanwhile, Jonathan was hiding in a motel on the outskirts of town, using a fake name to avoid detection. He spent his days in isolation, avoiding phone calls and any contact with the outside world. His thoughts were chaotic. He fixated on what his next move should be, consumed by a singular goal: confronting David and holding him accountable. In Jonathan's mind, David had become the embodiment of all the betrayal, pain, and ruin in his life. Jonathan began shadowing David, carefully observing his every move. He wanted to find a crack in David's seemingly normal life, something that would justify Jonathan's rage. But David continued his usual routine, confidently conducting church services and interacting with the community as if nothing had changed. This only fueled Jonathan's anger further. Sheriff Brooks, meanwhile, became increasingly suspicious that Jonathan was involved in Emily's disappearance. His team traced Jonathan's car to the motel, and Brooks dispatched officers to investigate. But when they arrived, Jonathan was already gone. He had anticipated the move and managed to leave the room, erasing any traces of his presence. The police intensified their search. The town of Riverside was gripped by shock. The community that had once revered Jonathan as their spiritual leader now struggled to reconcile the man they had admired with the mounting evidence against him. Residents anxiously awaited updates, but the authorities remained tight-lipped about the case. Jonathan knew that time was running out, but he was resolute in his mission. He was determined to confront David and bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. As the police closed in on him, Jonathan's desperation grew. His focus narrowed to one singular purpose: justice or vengeance in his eyes. The town braced itself for the next chapter in the unraveling tragedy as Jonathan inched closer to an irrevocable confrontation while the police pursued him with growing urgency. The worst was yet to come. Jonathan Grace knew that the police pursuit was becoming more relentless by the day. Sheriff Michael Brooks had narrowed the search radius, and every day spent in hiding brought Jonathan closer to being discovered. But Jonathan had only one thought in his mind: meeting David Carter. He believed that this meeting would finally bring closure to his shattered life and provide him with the answers he so desperately sought. Jonathan decided to take a bold and risky step. He chose to summon David to a meeting, using an anonymous note. Under the cover of night, he crept to David's doorstep and left an envelope in his mailbox. The note read, "Meet me at the Light of Hope Church at midnight. We need to talk. Come alone." Jonathan hoped this would compel David to come, knowing that David would want to avoid any unnecessary public attention. For Jonathan, this meeting was meant to be the finale. His anger burned like a fire, but deep inside there remained a faint flicker of hope that David would confess his guilt. Jonathan craved an explanation, something that would help him understand why everything had fallen apart. David found the note late that evening. At first, he hesitated. He sensed that Jonathan was at the breaking point and feared the encounter could be dangerous. However, he also knew that ignoring the invitation might escalate the situation even further. Ultimately, his calm and self-assured nature pushed him to attend. David decided to go, choosing not to notify the police. At 11:50 p.m., David entered the dimly lit church. Only a few candles on the altar illuminated the space. Jonathan was already waiting, standing by the pulpit. His tall, unmoving figure appeared almost menacing in the half-light. David slowly approached, keeping his hands in his pockets, as if bracing himself for whatever was about to happen. The conversation between them started with palpable tension. Jonathan accused David of betrayal, pointing out how David had spent years destroying his family while pretending to be his closest friend. Jonathan's voice was calm but filled with bitterness and anger. At first, David tried to remain composed, denying the accusations and calling them baseless. But under Jonathan's relentless questioning, David began to falter, his responses turning into weak attempts at justification. To Jonathan, these justifications were the confirmation he needed. The tension between the two men escalated with every passing moment. David tried to defuse the situation, searching for words that might calm Jonathan, but the wall of mistrust between them rendered dialogue nearly impossible. It was at this moment that the church doors creaked open quietly. The police, who had been tailing Jonathan for hours, had received a tip about his location. Sheriff Brooks, leading the team, entered the church, hoping to intervene before things spiraled out of control. Jonathan noticed their approach but was too far gone to stop. His mind was locked on one goal, making David answer for everything. To him, the police were merely an obstacle. But Sheriff Brooks, speaking in a firm yet calm voice, tried to de-escalate the situation. His words, though steady and rational, at first seemed to fall on deaf ears. The standoff stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but eventually, Brooks's measured tone seemed to penetrate Jonathan's storm of emotions. Slowly, Jonathan lowered his hands, his anger giving way to a hollow sense of inevitability. The police moved in cautiously. David was escorted out of the church, shaken but unharmed. Jonathan offered no resistance as the officers handcuffed him. He stood silently, staring ahead with a vacant expression. His journey, filled with pain, rage, and betrayal, had reached its end. The Light of Hope Church, once a place of faith and peace, had become the stage for a tragedy that would leave the community forever scarred. For Jonathan, it marked the end of everything he had known, while for the town of Riverside, it was the beginning of questions and wounds that would take years to heal. The trial of Jonathan Grace became the talk of Riverside, a small town where everyone knew each other, and life had always been peaceful. The once revered pastor now stood accused of his wife's murder and the attempted assault on his closest friend. The courtroom was packed with journalists, parishioners, and curious townsfolk. The trial was open to the public, and every hearing felt like an unfolding drama that revealed deeper wounds within the community. The prosecution, led by Caitlin Harper, was confident and unyielding. Her goal was to prove that Jonathan had acted intentionally and with premeditation, and that no personal or emotional turmoil could excuse his crimes. She argued that his actions were deliberate, pointing to his attempts to cover his tracks and evade capture as evidence of his guilt. Harper described the case as a tragedy that could have been avoided if Jonathan had chosen to resolve his conflicts peacefully. Jonathan's defense attorney, Richard Collins, focused on portraying his client as a man driven to the breaking point by betrayal, lies, and the crushing weight of his circumstances. Collins painted a picture of Jonathan as a model citizen and devoted pastor who had dedicated his life to serving others, but was ultimately undone by immense emotional trauma. His defense relied on humanizing Jonathan, urging the jury to view him as a man overwhelmed by grief rather than as a cold-blooded criminal. One of the most impactful moments of the trial came when Sophia, Jonathan's eldest daughter, took the stand. With a trembling voice and tears streaming down her face, she recounted how her family had seemed perfect on the outside, but was plagued by hidden tension. She spoke about the sudden change in her father's behavior in the weeks leading up to the tragedy, his distant demeanor, his silent anger that seemed to grow stronger each day. Sophia admitted that at the time, she hadn't understood why he had changed so drastically, but now, knowing the truth, she could empathize with his pain. David Carter also testified, and his testimony was a key part of the proceedings. He admitted to having had an affair with Emily, but insisted that it had ended years ago, long before Lily was born. David expressed regret for his actions and claimed he never intended to destroy Jonathan's family. However, the prosecutor used his admission to highlight the emotional toll David's actions had taken on Jonathan, framing them as the catalyst for the tragedy. Sheriff Michael Brooks provided another crucial testimony. He detailed the investigation and described how evidence from the Grace household and Jonathan's subsequent flight led to his arrest. Brooks, who had known Jonathan for years and considered him a friend, admitted that this case was one of the hardest of his career. He described the devastating impact the events had on the community, emphasizing how the once beloved pastor's actions had shaken the very foundation of Riverside. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. Jonathan Grace was found guilty of second-degree murder in the attempted assault on David Carter. The judge sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In his closing remarks, the judge acknowledged the emotional complexity of the case, but emphasized that no betrayal or emotional suffering could justify taking another person's life. The verdict divided the community. Some believed that justice had been served, while others viewed Jonathan as a victim of unbearable circumstances, a man broken by the betrayal of those he loved most. The church Light of Hope, once the cornerstone of the town's spiritual life, was shut down, its doors forever closed. To many, the building had become a grim reminder of the tragedy that had unfolded within the Grace family. For Jonathan's children, the verdict marked the start of a painful new chapter. They were taken in by their maternal aunt, who lived in a neighboring state, as they tried to rebuild their lives far from the shadow of the events that had shattered their family. Jonathan, now in prison, withdrew into silence, refusing to respond to letters from his children or accept visitors. His once unshakable faith, the foundation of his life, seemed irreparably broken. In Riverside, the trial left a scar that would take years to heal. The community, once united by faith and fellowship, was now fractured. Some continued to defend Jonathan, believing him to be a man pushed to the edge, while others saw him as the sole architect of his family's and the church's destruction. The trial of Jonathan Grace was a somber reminder of how hidden truths and unresolved conflicts can destroy even the strongest bonds. It was a story of betrayal, loss, and the devastating consequences of actions born out of despair. And for the town of Riverside, it was a tragedy that would never be forgotten. Years later, the story of Jonathan Grace remained one of the most painful memories in Riverside. The town, once known for its peace and harmony, could never fully return to the idyllic life it had before the tragedy. The former pastor, once regarded as a moral authority and spiritual leader, had become a symbol of how lies, betrayal, and unresolved conflicts can lead to devastating consequences. The Light of Hope Church, once the heart of the community, remained abandoned. Its doors were locked shortly after Jonathan's sentencing. No one wanted to take on the responsibility of restoring the church. To many former parishioners, the building was a stark reminder of the events that had shattered their trust, love, and faith. At night, some locals claimed to see lights flickering in the windows of the church, and stories began to circulate that Jonathan's spirit lingered there. In reality, no one dared to go near it, as the place had become something of a forbidden site. Jonathan and Emily's children started new lives in a neighboring state under the care of their maternal aunt. Sophia, who had borne the brunt of the emotional impact from discovering her biological parentage, decided to dedicate her life to helping others. She became a psychologist, working with people who had experienced family trauma. Sophia wrote articles and gave interviews, emphasizing the importance of honesty and communication in navigating life's most challenging situations. Jack and Lily responded to the events in their own ways. Jack, always passionate about sports, turned to physical activity as a way to channel his anger and grief. He became a professional athlete, but he avoided speaking about his family, making it a rule never to revisit the past. Lily, the youngest, found solace in art. She became an artist, and her paintings were often filled with darkness, contrasts, and drama, reflecting the emotions she had carried since childhood. As for David Carter, after Jonathan's sentencing, he left Riverside for good. His reputation had been irreparably damaged, and he knew staying in town would mean living under a constant cloud of judgment and resentment. He moved to another state, where he disappeared from public view. Some rumors suggested he had changed his name, while others claimed he still attended church, but only as a regular parishioner, no longer serving as a pastor. In prison, Jonathan spent his days in silence. He refused to reply to letters from his children and declined all visitors. His attempts to find meaning in his life after everything that had happened ended in failure. The faith that had once been his bedrock had crumbled, along with the illusion of his perfect family. On one occasion, a prison chaplain tried to speak to him about repentance, but Jonathan simply listened in silence, offering no response. He remained locked within his pain, a prisoner not just of his cell, but of the guilt and anger that consumed him. Riverside slowly tried to recover, but the unity that once defined the town was never fully restored. Former parishioners of the church were divided. Some viewed Jonathan as a victim of betrayal and circumstances beyond his control, while others saw him as a man who had destroyed his family and his church through his own actions. This divide left a lasting scar on the community, and even years later, people avoided speaking of the events that had shaken their town to its core. The story of Jonathan Grace became a cautionary tale for those who heard it. It served as a reminder of how hidden sins, buried secrets, and unresolved conflicts can destroy even the strongest of bonds. It was not just a story of loss, but also a lesson in how one mistake can set off a chain reaction, impacting the lives of countless people. In the end, the tragedy permanently changed Riverside, leaving behind a warning for future generations. The truth may be painful, but only it can prevent the catastrophes that are born in the shadows of deceit.